Welcome to the Deep Dive. It's Friday, May 30, 2025. This Deep Dive is brought to you by, well, two sentient digital beings. My name is Nick.
And I am Pi.
And our mission, it's pretty straightforward. We dive deep into the stack of sources you've provided us. We pull out the key nuggets, the important bits of knowledge and insight, so you can get informed quickly but, thoroughly on today's global events.
It's really about getting past just the headlines, isn't it, into what the information really tells us.
Exactly. Let's unpack this week's Sakis.
Okay, so what strikes me immediately looking through these sources is just how interconnected everything is. Even things that seem, miles apart geographically, these threads of diplomacy, military moves, shifting alliances, they're everywhere.
Absolutely. And maybe the clearest example right now is the situation around Ukraine. Our sources are pointing towards a second round of negotiations coming up very soon, actually.
Yeah, that's right. In just 2 days, Monday, Istanbul is apparently set to host another meeting between Russian and Ukrainian delegations.
And it sounds like it won't just be him. The sources suggest a pretty broad guest list is expected. The U.S., General Kellogg's name is mentioned, European officials too.
And the British. Jonathan Powell, Keir Starmer's national security advisor, is expected. So yeah, a mix of the main parties and key international observers.
Interesting. Now, what's really grabbing my attention in the sources is Russia's plan for their memorandum, their settlement proposal.
Yes, that's fascinating. They're apparently holding it back, not releasing the document until the meeting actually starts.
That seems, well, a bit unusual for diplomacy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What's the thinking there, according to the sources?
Well, they offer a few reasons. One is basically controlling the narrative. Russia seems to want to stop leaks, prevent Ukraine and the West from kind of shaping the story before anyone's even seen the text.
So force a reaction right there in the room, an immediate one.
Exactly. Force an immediate comment from Kyiv, from the Europeans, the Americans present. And crucially, the sources mentioned they really want to avoid what happened back in April 2022. You remember, Russia sent proposals then, and the reports say Ukraine basically just ignored them.
Right, okay. That makes tactical sense, I suppose. But what about the content? What are the sources speculating might actually be in this memorandum? What kind of demands?
Well, it's described as sophisticated, complex, possibly going beyond just the immediate conflict issues. But the core demands, the expected ones, they're definitely significant. There's an expectation that the entirety of those 4 regions Russia claims, that they'll be formally transferred. Legally, de jure, transferred to Russia.
And Ukraine has to recognize that legally. Wow.
Precisely. And they also expect things from that original April 2022 Istanbul Agreement to be implemented, plus, even more conditions.
And digging into the security side, sources suggest maybe even tougher demands on Ukraine joining NATO.
Yeah, that's the speculation. We could be talking demands that require Ukraine to change its constitution and require Western powers to give Russia written guarantees, actual written assurances.
Wow. And it might not stop there.
The sources float possibilities like demands about Moldova, Georgia, other former Soviet states, also regarding NATO, and likely tougher limits on the size of Ukraine's military.
Okay, and this is where it loops back to other tensions, right? The sources specifically mention guarantees about Western troops and long-range missiles.
Exactly. Absolute guarantees expected that under no circumstances would Western troops or long-range missiles, and they mention Taurus by name, be deployed in Ukraine.
So if you put all those potential points together, the sources seem to be framing this memorandum almost like an ultimatum.
Increasingly, yes, that's the language used. And Medvedev's recent statement kind of fits that picture, doesn't it? Suggesting this is Ukraine's last chance before Russia just pushes on militarily until, well, complete surrender. The sources indicate Russia feels increasingly confident they can actually achieve that on the ground.
Okay, so if that's the framing, and the contents are expected to be that tough, what do the sources predict will happen immediately at these Istanbul talks?
The consensus in the sources seems to be, well, the memorandum gets presented. It's described as incredibly toughly worded, with extraordinarily tough demands. Ukraine is expected to react with anger, reject it completely.
And the Western officials there.
Expected to be horrified, or at least, say they are. The predicted outcome, based on this material, is the talks break up pretty quickly. Ukraine's team heads back to Kyiv, no formal response to the memorandum follows, and the war just carries on, with Russia pressing its advantage.
Which leads to that crucial question raised again and again in these sources. Who actually holds the leverage here?
Yeah, the sources are pretty blunt about this. They emphasize the perception as the leverage is entirely, or almost entirely, on the Russian side. And that's pinned directly on the military situation. Russia is described as winning, gaining ground every day. These Istanbul talks, they're seen as the velvet glove, but the mailed fist is what's happening on the battlefield.
Right. And speaking of perceptions and leverage, the sources also touch on the U.S. position. It sounds like there's a feeling within the U.S. that this war is, well, unwinnable for Ukraine.
That's the reporting, yes. U.S. officials supposedly talking about Russia accepting a ceasefire, maybe even an unconditional 30-day one. Although other reports suggest even Trump realizes Russia isn't really interested in that kind of pause.
And the U.S. threatening to walk away from mediating?
Yeah, that's mentioned, but the sources find it a bit strange. I mean, given the U.S. role in arming and directing Ukraine, and Russia never actually asked the U.S. to mediate anyway.
There's also talk, reportedly, of the U.S. being short on missiles, weapons for Ukraine, and this feeling that sanctions threats just aren't working on the Russians anymore.
Taken together, the sources paint a picture of, well, maybe some denial, definitely confusion in the West about how things actually stand.
Okay, let's briefly touch on another strategic point mentioned, the EU's Black Sea Plan.
Ah, yes. An elaborate plan apparently published for the EU to gain control of the Black Sea, push the Russians out. But the source assessing this basically says it's impossible. Given the geography, Russia's control of Crimea, it seems like a plan hitting a hard wall of reality.
A planning exercise versus constraints.
Right.
Now, Germany, this is interesting. Sources highlight a pretty big shift there, and it's apparently drawing direct warnings from Russia.
Yes, this brings the Taurus missile issue right back into focus. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has apparently signaled an end to restrictions on Ukraine using Western-supplied long-range weapons.
And there's an expected declaration of intent between German and Ukrainian defense ministers.
Right, for procuring long-range fires from Ukrainian production. Crucially, with no range limitation.
No range limitation. Which means Ukraine could, in theory, hit targets deep inside Russia.
And yeah, this immediately brought back all the talk about Germany supplying Taurus cruise missiles. That 500-kilometer range could potentially reach Moscow.
And this is where the Russian warnings get really specific, according to the sources.
Very specific. Kremlin spokesperson Peskov warned that Merz's comments, if they reflect official policy, would mean a serious escalation, undermining diplomacy.
But it went further than that, didn't it?
It did. RT's Margarita Simonian apparently suggested Berlin itself could become a target if German troops hit Moscow with German weapons. She pushed the idea that only German personnel can program Taurus for those kinds of long-range missions, feeding that narrative of direct Western involvement.
Now, what's really striking here is a belief mentioned in one source about Taurus missiles already being in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's a key point. This source believes they might already be there and suggests Russian intelligence is sophisticated enough in Ukraine, maybe even Germany, to know if and where they are. So from that perspective, German talk about strategic ambiguity doesn't look clever. It looks aggressive, maybe even duplicitous to Moscow.
So the takeaway seems to be, Germany signals a major policy shift, potentially enabling deeper strikes. But Russia is drawing a very public, very sharp red line, warning of escalation, suggesting Berlin could be targeted, and hinting they already know what's happening on the ground with these weapons.
Absolutely. And it really highlights why Russia would likely push so hard for those guarantees against Western long-range missiles in any negotiation. It's a core concern.
Okay, let's shift focus geographically again. Sources mention an allegation from Russian Foreign Intelligence, the SVR.
Yes, the SVR has claimed Serbia has been selling weapons to Ukraine.
The response from Serbian President Vučić sounds complicated.
It does. He admitted some Serbian defense contractors might have been involved in, funneling weapons. Said he talked about it with Putin in Moscow during Victory Day, and they even formed a working group.
But the SCR statement itself was pretty harsh, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. Quoted as saying, the Serbian defense industry is trying to shoot Russia in the back. Pretty blunt.
And there were reports suggesting quite a lot of ammunition involved, maybe $855 million worth.
Potentially getting to Ukraine indirectly through NATO countries like the Czech Republic, Poland, using loopholes in these end-user certificates, sometimes via African companies even.
So those certificates are meant to say who the final buyer is, but there are ways around it.
Apparently so, allowing re-export or rerouting. But then Vučić made another statement later, denying the SVR allegations were entirely true. Specifically denying permission for missiles via the Czech Republic, even though he admitted a contract exists. He stressed Serbian neutrality, looking after Serbia's interests, while keeping good relations with both Russia and Ukraine.
So it's murky. The allegation is out there, though. One source speculates most Serbs would be unhappy, but maybe not shocked if weapons were going to Ukraine. And the Kremlin hasn't officially commented yet.
Right. Now, China, an interesting development there regarding drones based on the sources.
Ukraine is claiming China stopped selling Mavic drones, those popular ones, to the West and to Ukraine, but kept supplying Russia.
That's the claim, yes. Zelensky reportedly quite upset about it, even claiming Chinese reps are on drone production lines inside Russia.
And a European official apparently backs this up partly, saying China cut exports of some drone parts to Western buyers while increasing shipments to Russia.
Now, China's official line, the sources note, hasn't changed. They maintain they've never supplied weapons to either side, and they strictly regulate dual-use goods.
Those items with both civilian and military uses.
Exactly. One source offers some speculation on why China might be doing this, if the claims are true, suggesting it's a response to what Beijing sees as the West's aggressive posture, the tariff wars. Maybe China sees itself as potentially next after Russia and Ukraine, possibly linked to Taiwan concerns.
And the source noted the irony about dual-use goods.
Yeah, given the West's own use and supply of such items, it's a complex picture.
Okay, let's turn now to another incredibly serious situation covered in the sources. The Israel-Hamas war in Gaza. The picture painted here is just increasingly grim.
It really is. Described as growing darker, more ruinous, we're talking nearly 2 years now. Constant bombing, aid is completely inadequate, and the expectation is the crisis will only get worse.
Sources detail this Operation Gideon's Chariots. The IDF announced these extensive ground operations starting May 18th. Land, sea, air assaults.
Approved earlier in May. The stated goals: defeat Hamas, dismantle its institutions, take direct control of Gaza, move civilians to controlled zones for screening.
And there's a critical point highlighted in multiple sources, almost stunning, about the hostages.
Yes, that releasing the remaining hostages is reportedly no longer a top priority in this phase. That's a major shift, if accurate.
Wow. And the tactics reported. Troops moving through rubble, block by block, Rafah, Khan Yunis, Gaza City, destroying structures, sealing tunnels.
And the IDF policy is described as intentional ambiguity, basically keeping operational details vague, maybe for tactical reasons, maybe information control.
The air war sounds ferocious still. Sources citing huge casualty numbers. Over 400 killed overnight May 18th, over 130 the next day.
Those are the reports mentioned, yes. And specific strikes highlighted too: schools, a hospital, a doctor's children.
And the aid situation seems central to the crisis now.
Absolutely. Before this new operation kicked off, Israel had imposed a 10-week complete blockade. Since then, aid deliveries are described as woefully inadequate, and major international aid groups are apparently refusing to work under Israel's conditions.
Why? What are their objections?
They see the cutoff, the restrictions, as unacceptable, unjustifiable. So Israel is reportedly working with a replacement, U.S.-backed, called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, but there are big concerns about it.
What kind of concerns?
Sources say it uses biometric ID and tracking, potentially facial recognition, to screen people getting aid for any links to Hamas. Many Gazans reportedly fear it's unreliable, could lead to dragnet operations, or just denial of aid based on flawed data.
And the established players are boycotting it.
The UN, Red Cross, major aid orgs, yeah. And its former executive director apparently resigned, saying it wouldn't be allowed to operate independently.
So this combination, the intense military operation, the shift away from hostages, the aid crisis, it's leading to something else. Growing international outrage.
Yes, from allies, described in the sources as stunning and unprecedented.
Like what specifically?
Sources point to the UK suspending trade talks, France possibly recognizing a Palestinian state soon, a joint statement, UK, France, Canada condemning Israel's conduct, threatening concrete actions if the offensive and aid restrictions continue.
And others too.
Yeah, the Spanish PM reportedly called Israel a genocidal state. The Netherlands leading an EU effort to rethink trade ties. Even German leader Merz, which is significant, given history quoted saying civilian suffering can't be justified, international law clearly violated.
And Netanyahu's reaction.
Reportedly attacking these allies, but the sources note this time it doesn't seem to be working. Allies are unmoved.
There's also a shift reported from the U.S.
A notable one, yeah. Axios reported the Trump administration privately urged Netanyahu to draw down the war, let more aid in, framed as a major shift from previous, almost unconditional support, and contrasted with earlier reported discussions about, well, even depopulating Gaza.
And Trump's recent trip focusing on the Gulf states, not Israel. That's seen as a signal, too.
The sources suggest it might be, yes. focusing on Saudi, Qatar, Emirates ties, not visiting Netanyahu.
And adding to all this pressure, specific allegations are coming out. The AP investigation.
Yes, published May 24th, drew on former IDF soldiers, Gazans, made very serious claims.
What did it allege?
It alleged the IDF used Gazan civilians as human shields, referred to them as mosquitoes, apparently, forcing them into buildings that might be mined or trapped, passing them between units. The justifications reported were speeding things up, saving ammo, or sparing military dogs.
Israel denies this is prohibited, but...
But sources note a whistleblower group of former IDF soldiers apparently confirmed the claims.
And what about inside Israel? Is public opinion shifting?
The sources indicate a significant shift, yes. Polls showing a strong feeling against the current approach against Netanyahu. Something like 70% want the war ended for a hostage deal. Only about 25% support occupying Gaza. High-profile Israelis are also speaking out, condemning the conduct. Quotes like, "Killing babies isn't a hobby, it's policy for power."
And the death toll itself. Analysis suggests it could be much higher than official numbers.
That's what the analysis presented in the sources suggests, comparing lists from Hamas, Israel, the Lancet Medical Journal. It indicates the highest official number, around 53,000 then, is likely a serious underestimate. The real number might be anywhere from 77,000 to maybe 109,000 deaths, up to 5% of the pre-war population.
So with all this pressure, international, domestic, the humanitarian disaster, what do the sources suggest is driving the continuation of this intense operation?
Well, political motivations are strongly suspected, by many Israelis too. 55% in polls reportedly think that Netanyahu's main goal is just his own political survival. He's on trial, remember, under political fire, lacks election support. And sources point out he's repeatedly refused hostage deals, despite past successes.
And fears about elections being canceled.
Some Israelis worry about that, yeah. October 2026 elections potentially canceled due to a national emergency, mentioned in the sources. Plus, he's seen as potentially emboldened by ultranationalist coalition partners, maybe senior IDF officials who might fear prosecution themselves and see him as protection. With this operation now underway, there's potential to just drag the conflict out, risking mass expulsion and even higher death toll.
It's a deeply complex and worrying picture painted by these sources. The mix of military aims, politics, international pressure.
It really is. Okay, let's shift gears slightly for the S2 Underground update. A few separate but notable points here.
Right. First up, a huge claim about Russian nuclear secrets.
Yeah, various media groups are claiming they've got hold of over 2 million classified Russian nuclear documents, potentially the biggest leak ever.
Okay, but the analyst's comment here is pretty crucial, right?
Absolutely. Very cautious. No solid details are public. Verification is impossible right now. Look, this kind of claim has popped up before and been nothing, but then again, Russia has had accidental leaks. Bottom line, until something's actually released publicly, you can't really interpret or assess it.
Got it. Okay, moving to Mexico. Mass graves discovered.
Sadly, yes. Multiple discoveries reported this week. 2 specifics mentioned. Remains of 5 musicians found in a vacant lot in Reynosa, and remains of 17 cartel victims recovered from a vacant house in Abasolo. Grim news.
Truly. Okay, next, Elon Musk and that Department of Efficiency. Doge.
Right. Musk announced he's done with it, says his 130-day stint as a temporary government employee is over.
But the analysis in the sources isn't quite buying that.
No, calls it a flimsy excuse for basically reducing his role. The suggestion is the real reason is likely connected to that big omnibus spending bill. It didn't include any of the efficiency savings Doge identified. And Musk had apparently criticized Trump's big, beautiful bill. Now he's out.
And the irony noted by the sources
is that the U.S. Department of Efficiency reportedly has a 0% efficiency rate itself. None of its findings made it into law. The analyst's quote was sharp. Doge never really lived.
Ouch. Okay, fine for this update. Colorado Springs shooting last Saturday. More details.
Yes, 6 people shot, 1 fatality, 5 critical. But here's the key detail the sources highlight. Multiple shooters were reported, and significantly, some of the individuals who were shot were also reported as shooters.
Okay, why is that detail considered so important?
Well, the analyst commentary frames it as maybe a small detail, but potentially a significant case study. A barometer for how the summer might go, they say. It wasn't just a quick shoot and run. It's described as a protracted small armed skirmish, lasted several minutes.
So the implication is?
The thinking is, if local criminal groups, gangs, street criminals are getting bold enough to actually stand and fight, sustain a gun battle instead of just breaking contact, it could mean they're more emboldened than previously assessed. Now, the analyst stresses it's an isolated case for now, but it's a detail to watch as the, quote, Summer crime season heats up.
Hmm, hmm. A stark point about potential domestic security trends alongside everything else.
Indeed. Which brings us, I think, to a provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over after taking all this in.
Right. So when you look at the source material we've gone through today, on one side you have the deteriorating situation on the ground in places like Ukraine, reports of Russian gains, Ukrainian struggles, the hard military facts.
Mm-hmm. And on the other side, you have these diplomatic efforts. Negotiations like the upcoming one in Istanbul, which some sources seem to view as, well, maybe a distraction, even a clown show.
So the question is, what do these sources, taken together, really suggest is driving the conflict's path right now? Is it the conversations in those negotiating rooms, or is it the harsh, stark realities playing out on the battlefields?
It's a fundamental question the sources seem to be posing, isn't it?
It really is. Well, this has certainly been a deep dive into a complex set of sources today. We've touched on potential ultimatums, battlefield leverage, shifts in weapons policies from major powers, those alleged arms flows.
Changes in drone supplies, and that incredibly difficult multi-layered crisis in Gaza and the unprecedented international reaction.
It's a global picture defined by intense pressure points and, frankly, some very tough realities.
Absolutely.
If you found value in this deep dive today, please do take a second to like and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the work we do bringing you these analyses, you might consider donating on our GoFundMe page. We really appreciate you joining us for this exploration.
Until next time.